BlomCast. Turning points in history. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm joined by Julian Baggini, philosopher, author, thinker, one of the people who's been really a very distinctive voice in the debate for quite a while now. And Julian, it's a pleasure to talk to you. You've written about so many things, from the philosophy of the world and different cultures to ideas of the self to eating. But when I invited you to be part of the BlomCast, you said, well, I've got something that I'd like to discuss with you, and it's got to do with the Enlightenment. So go ahead, shoot.
Yeah, okay, well, I have to back up on this. Obviously, I thought this is a great opportunity. Your book, I read, researched your book on the Enlightenment was terrific, and so it's good to talk to people who know more about something than you. So I need to back up on this to sort of give some background to it. The general issue I'm interested in is value change and value variation across times and cultures. Now, when I was working on the book, you alluded to how the world thinks about global philosophy. One of the most useful things I read was from a comparative philosopher called Tom Kasoulis. And he made the point, when people talk about, philosophy East and West, they very easily slip into these sort of like dichotomous black and white things. In the East they're collectivist, in the West they're individualistic.
In the East it's all harmony, in the West it's all,
Yeah, exactly. In this very, very sort of simplistic black and white way. Now, he says, of course there are cultural differences. That's just undeniable. But it's always a mistake to think of them as these sort of little binary either-ors. And he had this expression, which I can paraphrase, it's almost a quote, which is that what you have to realise is that what is background in one culture is foreground in another, and vice versa. So what he's really saying is that, I don't know if he'd literally say that the set of values which a society have is kind of universal, maybe not completely universal, but most values you find everywhere, and the difference is in the weighting, about how important they are. And I think that really resonated with me, and I thought that's right.
I've made that experience, for instance, with the idea of human equality, which is I think a very interesting one, because you can see that foregrounding and backgrounding very strongly, because we've both been working on the Enlightenment, and the idea that humans are equal, which is so platitudinous to us today, was an absolute scandal in the 17th century, because every decent person knew that people were unequal, of course. A man was more valuable than a woman, and a Christian more than a heathen, and an aristocrat more than a farmer. And it was this inequality that built the moral foundation of society. But the thought of equality was there since ancient Greece, was there in ancient China, was there in so many traditions, of course, was sort of taken and then perverted by Christianity. But you can very well see how this Western tradition pushed this thought into the background before it popped up, I think, with a social movement, namely a rising middle class in Europe in the 17th and 18th century again.
Okay, yeah, good example. So that's the general sort of principle. Now, so if we think about the Enlightenment, again, there's a naive way of thinking about the Enlightenment. I think it's naive, which is, as a new set of values kind of emerged, maybe not from nowhere, but, and they kind of just overturned the others. Whereas I think probably it's more correct to say that what happened was that there was an important shift in which values took priority and which slipped into the background. So that's one way of thinking about it. And the other thing is, of course, that a secondary point, so it's not just about weighting foreground and background, it's also about how we understand the values. So if we think about equality as a value, to take the example you've got there, actually, as a value, it can be interpreted in different ways. So, quite notoriously, I think, a lot of people say, although the Enlightenment promoted this value of equality, it was kind of selective, because women were not treated the same as men. Even great Enlightenment thinkers like Hume thought that the black people were intellectually inferior, as he would have put it. So you've also got those changes in how we actually sort of understand what these values are. Now, the reason I think this is I wanted to talk about it was lots of people are talking now about the crisis of Enlightenment values in the West today, in particular. And I think perhaps if we're going to understand what's going on, we need to see it through these two lenses, which is not just that, people are trying to totally reject the Enlightenment values and replace them with others. It is about a reassertion of some which have gone into the background. And importantly, I'm wondering whether or not there is something we need to understand about that positively. Is it not possible that in asserting certain Enlightenment values, maybe some other values were suppressed too far, maybe?
You're very cautiously and politely banging on open doors here.
So that's the first thing. And before, just let me say the second thought, and then you follow up on what you think of that. And the second thought, of course, then is we also need to sort of like, not just sort of like knee-jerky say, oh, Enlightenment values. We need to think more about what they are and whether we've got the right interpretation of them, for example.
It's very, very interesting because, I'm talking about with my guests quite often on this podcast about what I call the sort of end of the West or the end of the liberal project, not liberal in an Enlightenment way, not a liberal party way, liberal in a sort of Isaiah Berlin way of liberalism. And I do think that there is an argument to be made that the West is seeming to drop these values out of boredom, because we just can't be bothered anymore, because it's all really quite exhausting to enact these values in day to day in societies. And I think there's also an economic argument to be made of rising inequality, but also very much an intellectual argument to be made about the hollowing out of those values. And indeed, an examination to be made of these ideas themselves, the Enlightenment ideas. What I always think is that, and try to argue, is that the Enlightenment was vastly more theological than we give it credit for being. That it transferred a lot of ideas directly from Christian theology, which many of the Enlighteners had learned in school, of course, into a secular vocabulary. For instance, the exceptional state of human beings towards the rest of nature. This idea of rationality, which is so close to the Christian soul. The idea of progress, which is so close to the Christian salvation story. So, I think it's also important to look at the structure of this Enlightenment revolution itself and what resonances it can and should have for us today.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just ask: when you said at the beginning of that comment that they're being lost partly out of boredom, say a little bit more about that. That's interesting.
I think that, look, I don't want to sound terribly reactionary and have this idea of rights and duties in a society, but we are certainly very much rights-based societies, and we are all very keen on the rights we have. If it comes to the fact that, for instance, for a working democracy, we should all be informed enough to take these important decisions that we are made to take when we elect people, that is something that, or even indeed to go and vote, that becomes something that is seen as a bit of an imposition. That's just a step too far. And I think in many of these cases where this social project becomes also an individual responsibility, now that all these ideas have become institutionalized and securely established in our societies, the determination to have them and to defend them is slipping away, it seems.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting, because that sort of fits in with the one perception I've got around individualism. So to sort of go back to the framing I have of it, it seems to me, and you're the expert on the period, you tell me if I'm wrong, that one of the major shifts of the Enlightenment was an emphasis upon the individual, rights of the individual, which previously just wasn't as strong. It was much more about the society and the rulers, whatever it might be. So it came with equality. So this emphasis on the individual, which was a kind of, I think, a really valuable rebalancing. So I think that was good. As you say, though, that's not about, it's not individual versus, it's not a kind of an either or. We still recognise we have duties towards our fellow citizens and to our democratic structures. So that rebalancing still required an important emphasis on our collective responsibilities as well. And I think on this particular value, I think you're right. I think what's happened is that the sort of narrative of the individual liberty and freedom has kind of drifted to an extreme, which is too much. So the metaphor I use is like a mixing desk in a recording studio, where you have the different instruments and you set the volume of the different instruments to create the balance. And it's like, a society sets the volume of its values, to use that metaphor. We turned up the volume on the individual in the Enlightenment. Excellent, fantastic. But it's gone to, yeah. And now I just think it's just got so loud and it's crowded out. We're not hearing the collective thing.
No, and that's a very, very important thing. But of course, having killed God, to have that collective thing, I think our societies to some extent still have a God-shaped hole in their skies. And this certainty has not yet been replaced. And yes, as a good atheist, I think God needed to be killed. But basically, people lived in often fairly rigid systems that were very cruel to some, but gave most a sense of orientation, a sense of selfhood, a sense of social belonging. That might not have been very intelligent, that did not give them many freedoms, but it gave them a sense of belonging. We have slightly abolished that, and with that, as you say, we have lost that sense of belonging. And I think also we can embed this a little bit politically in the post-war time, because I think social peace was also bought, first of all, of course, on the back of a catastrophe. That meant that there was a strong sense to avoid any sort of, avoid war again. But also it was based on depoliticizing societies to some extent and make consumers out of citizens and talk to them as consumers. And that actually was quite beneficial because these economies did need to grow after the war. They were devastated. And also perhaps people had enough of great ideologies. But if you talk to people as consumers, as we all know, then you talk to individuals, then you tell people they're amazing, then you tell people that they're absolutely unique and they can become even more so if they only buy this, etc. And, there's so many even empirical studies that show the difference, how people react if they're talked to as consumers or as citizens. You can ask them, there's a famous study where people have been given a questionnaire and they ask the same questions about what should happen to their city, but in the first question, the first 5 asked them something as citizens and about their responsibilities to society, and in the other question, the first questions talk to them as consumers and their personal dreams and ambitions, and the results are different.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm quite aware of that kind of work in the UK. John Alexander has been one person really promoting that and pointing to these studies. And I think this is again the individualism sort of volume being turned up too much, so that we do see ourselves as. I think in democracy this is really important as well, because I think this is the way people seem to think about voting now. I mean, I have a little cheesy slogan, which is voting is having your say, not getting your way. I think people think voting is like shopping. If you vote for something, you should get it, and it's as simple as that.
You buy a product, and you have a guarantee.
Right, it is like that, yeah. And whereas actually, it's not the democracy works because it isn't majoritarianism. It's not winner takes all. You don't just get what you want because you've chosen it, and so it's like there's something is given to the person who's voted in governs for all. They don't just give to the person who chose and they have the loser. And I think that's kind of lost now. But going back to the other thing you were saying about, the God-shaped hole, well, I'm always a little nervous of that because it's often advocated for people who advocate a return to traditional Christianity, which I'm not keen on.
No, neither am I.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the beginning of the Enlightenment, I think particularly in France, it seemed like they were really acutely aware of the need for that. So they talked a lot about, the citizen word, was used a lot, fraternité as well as égalité, and also the explicit attempts at Comte, wasn't it, to sort of establish a kind of atheist church, and the way the Pantheon was turned into. It's almost like the early Enlightenment. They sort of really feared, if you like, that without the collective rituals of something a bit like a religion, you wouldn't have the cohesion. But it didn't work, and I think it's interesting as to why it didn't work. I don't know if you've got any theories on that.
Well, I mean, first of all, yes, I think many of them were religious to their bones, even if they were no longer believing in a god. But, and they also thought that these were important social rituals. I think it doesn't work when you replace a revealed living being with a metaphor. It's very hard to take that seriously. And it's very hard to come together and think, well, we're performing a ritual here, do nothing really, because rituals are important. You can't get people with that. You can get people with the idea that if you don't perform this ritual, you will die in it. You will die and live in eternal misery. You can get them with a real presence in their lives, but not with a metaphor. But I think this is really interesting to explore, and this is a little bit thinking on the hoof, which I always enjoy. But you are asking the question about the balance between the I and the we, essentially, in the Enlightenment. My good old friend Denis Diderot had, to my mind, the most intelligent answer to this religious question. I mean, Diderot was the great atheist of his time, the most reviled thinker of his time. But he was also nostalgic for the ability to believe. And there are testimonies that even when he was an old man, when a religious procession went by the house, tears welled up in his eyes, because he had been brought up to be a priest. That career he had abandoned at 15. But, he knew that world, and he knew that world of belonging, of objective moral standards, of a predestined way that was waiting for you, of an established objective harmony that you have to. And he had abandoned all that. But what distinguishes him from most other Enlightenment thinkers is that he faces the absurdity of this situation, because he gets involved in the theater, he becomes a writer of plays, he writes about acting very famously, and you realize, or at least I think, he uses the theater as a moment to live these emotions. The world is meaningless and nothing good happens for a good reason, but in the theater it does. In the theater you can feed the fiction that there is a meaning, that there is a structure, that good actions are rewarded, etc. And it is only rewarding to go into a theater if you practice Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief. And you think you really do see Othello suffering and squeezing Desdemona's throat. But when you go out on the street, you shouldn't attack the actor, because you should realize that was in there, and I believed it for the time, and I needed that, my soul needed that to have an idea of order that it can correspond to. But out on the street, I'm living a different life, and both inform the other. But I must not, as it were, collapse into the world of the theater performance, because then I've become religious again. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. But I suppose I've got a question mark about, you said it's difficult to replace kind of a eternal deity with a metaphor. But I think that we don't have to replace it with a metaphor. For eternity, is not a metaphor. It's something that exists. Society exists. Our ties to human beings exist. And there are lots of situations where you can see that really does strongly motivate people in the absence of any kind of other divine purpose. I mean, I have a lot of discussions, sort of atheist religious sort of dialogues, and these discussions, and people look for the common ground between believers and non-believers, and people always sort of seem to come back to this idea of the transcendent, which I'm a bit suspicious of. But if you just take the idea of that feeling of belonging and having duty to something greater than yourself, I think, religious or not, people do have that sense about their humanity.
Perhaps it's just a step too little, because it's not transcendence, it's a longing for transcendence that unites us. On the atheist side of the debate, we would just say we long for transcendence, but it ain't there.
Well, I think I'm not keen about the word transcendence, but there's something greater than ourselves is there. It's the greater community that is real. That's not there. And there are times where that is absolutely enough. I think if you look about what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, for example, I mean, there is a lot of religious belief in Ukraine, but not everyone is religious. People are motivated primarily because of the solidarity. I think the other interesting example is perhaps the Scandinavian societies. And I know things are changing there, and we mustn't romanticize Scandinavian social democracy. But here are societies where there is quite a, surveys tend to show they have quite high degrees of social trust and so forth. And they've also got quite high levels of religious unbelief. It seems there you have had functioning social solidarity, not too individualistic, while allowing individual freedom without the necessary framework of religion.
But Julian, that goes back a long way in those places. I mean, I'm half Dutch, and in the Netherlands, it's like Scandinavian society is a very egalitarian society. You call each other by the first name. And it's a very democratic society in many ways. And even in the Middle Ages and even further back, the maintenance of the dikes was delegated to village communities who elected a leader for a year. And, power just worked differently. It was more communal, it was more collaborative. There was a much weaker aristocracy already for centuries.
No, I can see that. But what we're saying is that the different histories make certain things more or less difficult. But it means that, I suppose the reason I think it's worth thinking about this as a positive example is that I fear that if we talk about the God-shaped whole, and replacing metaphors with erasing something divine with metaphor, there's a temptation we're going to sound fatalistic. It's like this can never work, basically. It just can't work. Without religion, it can't work. Now, without religion, it can work, but it's difficult.
It is much more difficult. And also, don't forget, and I think we often forget that, we've had so little time to get used to these ideas. If I speak about killing God, that's Nietzsche. And that is written in the 1880s or so. So that's 150 years ago. That is how much? 4 generations. Since this has become a public discourse, since, then look at what at the same time industrialization does to our societies, new information technologies, etc., etc. I think this is such a huge change for humanity to absorb, to reorientate itself, that 4 generations are not all that much. To exit one metaphorical system, which has been very powerful for 200 generations or so, and to find a new one, and perhaps even to find the language in which to speak about this new one. That is a fascinating, but there's also a huge anthropological challenge.
I think that's true, and I think that one thing we have to recognise if we are going to promote the kind of Enlightenment values we want is to appreciate the difficulty of the task, and to also then appreciate the fact that if you manage this task incorrectly, you end up, there's a throwing babies out with bathwaters, right? That you have to recognize that some of the sort of values that people really valued then, they still value today for good reason. So, for example, if we see a lot of the backlash against sort of like liberal values in lots of European countries and North America, what is it that people are very unhappy about? Now, I think the point is there is obviously a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what's going on. But nevertheless, I think it's not just about that. It's that people are feeling that what they see as the liberal elites don't have the respect for things like community and tradition, right? And that they turn their noses up on these things. They just want to be rootless cosmopolitans, etc. And I think there is something in that complaint, I think. At the very least, the rhetoric of a lot of the liberal left is like that. And so I think that if you're really serious about promoting sort of Enlightenment values around individual liberty and freedom, you have to recognise the fact that that cannot be just at the total expense of those other values, and they're not bad things. And the other things, I think one way to make people realise that is to think that whatever people may say about, cosmopolitanism, etc., etc., actually almost everybody does value some of these things about tradition and community, whether they like it or not. I have a typical kind of thing where I've lived in kind of neighbourhoods which are politically quite liberal and everything, and there's often not necessarily a strong settled community there, because it's the kind of places where people have bought up the properties with money and things like that. But people yearn for it. When they have the street party, for example, everybody goes out and says how great it is that the street is together as a community, even though most of the people they've never spoken to until that day, and afterwards they don't speak to them very much either. So that sort of desire for community is something that people really do value. And the other thing is, actually what I find the almost amusing thing about this is that a lot of the people who are really keen on cosmopolitanism, etc., really celebrate the homogeneity and continuity of other cultures. So, for example, Notting Hill Carnival in London is something the Afro-Caribbean community have been doing it for years. And, liberal white people love to go and dance and eat jerk chicken, all that kind of stuff. But of course, what makes it the carnival is it is very, very much rooted in a particular community with their traditions. And so I think that we've just got to be a bit more honest here. That yes, we're in favour of individual liberty. We don't want anyone to feel they have to be trapped within their community of birth by its values, etc. But at the same time, there is value in community tradition continuity as well.
Absolutely. There's a very interesting sociologist, and she's called Pippa Norris. She teaches in the States, and she has an idea that I think is a bit of a curate's egg. It's good in parts, but it interests me very much. She talks about the effect of the '68 revolution on societies. And she points out that the people who were part of that revolution, this revolution basically took place in universities. One also has to say in universities in the West, in the Eastern Europe, it wasn't part of the '68 revolution, despite of the Prague Spring. And these liberal values were carried out of the universities into where university graduates go, into the media, into government, into positions of power, into the professions, etc. And at least her assertion is a lot of other people in society were simply not taken, were not swept up by that rhetoric, were not swept up. They inherited the practical effects of the '68 revolution, such as the pill or such as equality for women, but they had not made the intellectual journey as well. And now, of course, the people who had been the revolutionaries were in the position of power to institutionalize their values. And all of a sudden, people who had not been part of that, who basically think what their parents think or thought. That they know who's a man and who's a woman, and that patriotism is a good thing, and that their religion is their religion, all of a sudden they're bigots and reactionaries. And you can see how that... I find that quite an interesting analysis, that this partial revolution then becomes generalized. And there's a backlash because people feel, well, nobody asked us.
No, absolutely. I think that's spot on. And, we have this debate in the UK, I don't know whether it's the same there, that there are people who are politically liberal, sort of centre-left and left, who make these points. And they always face the backlash that they're actually becoming apologists for bigotry and racism, that by saying, oh, these are people have understandable concerns, they are legitimising what the far right are saying. Whereas I think that's completely untrue. I think we've got to recognise the fact that we want to be very clear that a lot of what the far right is saying is just completely wrong, and there's a lot of lies about what's going on. But it's a totally separate point to say that they are tapping into what we use the phrase genuine concerns.
But it's the contortion of arguments that always gets made. I mean, we've just seen the most cynical of that. The accusation of anti-Semitism whenever you criticize anything the Israeli government is doing. I think that argument has now been exposed, and I think you no longer can argue that what this government does is in any way legal and that this is not a terrible crime what's happening there, and that it's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism to say that. It's something to do with international law. But this is a very useful rhetorical strategy, of course. And in the case of being an apologist, yes, for the right wing, I think it is terribly important that liberal, progressive people take the topics that the right wing has made their own seriously. I mean, look at, for instance, the change in the conversation about migration. Of course, it is a crisis when a state can no longer control its borders. And if there are a significant number of people in the state that are not part of the state system, of course that is a problem for any state. That has got nothing to do with rejecting migration or migrants. But a balance needs to be found. And as long, I think, as progressive politicians, progressive intellectuals refuse to acknowledge this reality or to discuss it, you leave such good arguments to the right. And also, of course, you have to accept that we are not the people whose direct life is impacted by the effect of migration, whose neighborhood changes, whose work prospects change, etc. We look at this whole question from a very different and rather luxurious perspective. And I think just because it doesn't impact us, it doesn't mean that we should be very fast to judge how it impacts others.
I also think, to push this a bit further, I think there can be there's sometimes just a straightforward hypocrisy in the sense that it's almost like sometimes the idea is that liberal values there's a kind of an elitism about it. Liberal values are for people like us. They're not for other people, actually. So the clearest example of this is when a lot of people on the liberal left and everything are really passionate about things like indigenous land rights and all that kind of thing. So you think about what they're saying. What they're saying is that people who have lived for a long time in a particular area of land, and for a long time, it's not necessarily they're the original people. The Maori of New Zealand arrived; they just arrived before the white settlers.
They arrived 800 years ago or so, yes.
Yeah. So these people have a right to their land, and they have a right to maintain their own traditions on those lands, their own values on their lands, and that if anyone sort of comes in from the outside and changes them, that's imperialism, that's whatever it might be. If you think about that's kind of really asserting the importance of values of tradition, stability, community, etc., etc. But then We, on the other hand, are supposed to be entirely open and not have any kind of similar kind of attachment to our ways and traditions, right? And I think this is actually just plain hypocrisy. And the reason it exists, of course, is that there is value in openness and diversity. And certainly there's nothing at all right about racism and xenophobia, etc. But there's also value in tradition, stability, community. Balancing these two things is very, very difficult.
So how do you make a liberal balance these two things? That when a Maori says this is our land and these are our ways and our values, that is a sacred thing. And when somebody in Liverpool says we are white and this is our land and these are our traditions and our values, then he is a bigot and a racist.
Exactly. So how does a liberal balance these things? I think it's difficult. I'm not sure I have a straightforward answer to that.
Is this at least part of the fictional answer, again, authenticity? That we impute to indigenous cultures that they are authentic and that authenticity in a sort of rather Rousseauian way must be good? And that people who live in cities nowadays, they are obviously inauthentic and manipulated and ill-informed, and therefore their opinions cannot be trusted.
I'm sure there is something in that. But the question of how we balance it, I think, is genuinely quite a difficult one. And it's probably one which is going to strike people as kind of perhaps boring and almost kind of technocratic, because it means, I think it's, migration's good, managed migration, and there needs to be also an element of integration. It's not about sort of like forcing everyone to be exactly the same, but there are minimal requirements. And again, it's interesting because, again, these liberal people will say if they go somewhere like to a Maori village or town, city, whatever it is, or they go elsewhere in the world, they will say how important it is as a visitor to respect that land. So they love it. I went to New Zealand many years ago, and when we arrived, there was a kind of a little kind of greeting ceremony in which, and they always begin by thanking the land for allowing them, etc., etc. And liberals go, that's fantastic, that's wonderful, it's great. And if you turned up and didn't participate in that, you'd be considered some horrible sort of like a bigot. But then if you say people moving to the Netherlands, for example, need to respect traditions of things like female equality, etc., etc., why do people feel that is a terrible imposition on immigrants? So again, there are just straightforward, I think, double standards here, and I think a lot of it is because we revert to simplicity because when the world is complex, and we don't notice sometimes that the two versions of simplicity we have are actually in direct contradiction with each other.
I also wonder whether sometimes the Enlightenment, much like Christianity again, has also saddled the so-called West with impossible values. That what we do and what we describe as evil, imperialism, slavery, etc., is essentially not different from what any other human society has done at some point. Slavery has been a universal institution, etc. There's been cruelty everywhere. The values we have and we lay on ourselves have changed radically. Universal human rights, the respect for every life. That is basically completely unlike the practice of any body of power that has ever existed. And it is a very daring experiment in humanity to make that happen, to make that possible, to build societies on those principles. But it shouldn't surprise us on the one hand that instincts are perhaps not yet there, where rational thought already is, and that it of course is impossible to balance these things when it comes to migration, for instance. There are hundreds of millions of people in the world who live in the most desperate circumstances and would absolutely have the human right to flee to a more wealthy country and live differently there. that cannot be realized, that is not possible. And we fail by the values that we have given ourselves. And in fact, we're pretty ordinary societies, just with more powerful technologies that can create more damage more quickly. But in our exercise of power, we're probably in a historical balance rather better than societies had been before, but we are distraught at our own performance because our values are effectively utopian. I like those utopian values, by the way, do not get me wrong. I'm just trying to really examine these ideas, and it's like what you said about the God-shaped hole and reintroducing religion. I think it's always a very important idea when you look back at history, especially at intellectual history, to understand that this has got nothing to do with nostalgia. What we're looking at is that things were different, worked differently at a different point, and that had several interesting consequences, and those we can analyze. This system has changed now, so there are different interesting consequences to look at. And I think this is very important. I do believe in the idea of this God-shaped hole. I do believe in the fact that most people have a longing for transcendence. And I believe that it's very difficult in a secular society that you basically have to tell people, sorry, but your longing cannot be answered. Unless we build a different kind of transcendence, which is no longer revealed from above and gives you the possibility to not take responsibility, but a kind of transcendence that rests essentially exactly on your responsibility, on the power of your own convictions to build something with others, but is ultimately up to you. It's a much harder thing to do.
Your point about the values, in a sense, being impossible. I think certainly they're extremely demanding. Whether they're impossible or not, I think, depends on how you understand them. And this goes back to the point I was saying right at the beginning. It's not just about how these values are weighted. It's that I think we kind of slip into assuming we know what they mean when there's more than one way of understanding them. And perhaps the best way of understanding them is not the way we're using them. Now, we go to equality, we talked about equality a fair bit today. I think it's a really, really good example. The value of equality, what does that mean? It means that every life has equal worth and has equal value. Now, that's true. Let's take that as a definition. Now, some people, I think, particularly for utilitarian bent, what that means, what follows from that, is that to treat people equally, you must, as an individual or as a society, treat every person exactly the same way, irrespective of their relation to you. So you have the kind of argument that Peter Singer gave, or he quoted actually somebody saying this guy who basically donated his organs and everything, and he was talking about how let's not take this concrete example, but let's say if I have an organ, right, a spare liver or something, it can give someone an extra kind of 30, 40 years of life, and it gives me a minor inconvenience. So if I choose to keep it, I'm valuing my own life at like 30 times the value of another person's, right? Now this is actually, it sounds reasonable, but I think it's actually absurd. Because the point is, as human beings, we are not detached from the world. We're not looking at it as gods. If we're looking at things as gods, yes, we treat we don't only accept the fact that every life has equal value. We treat everybody exactly the same, irrespective of their relationship to us. But as human beings, we are essentially enmeshed in relationships, and that means that it is possible both to believe that every life has equal value, and that individuals do not have equal responsibility to every individual in the world. And so the impossibility of equality, as you put it, only emerges if we think that equality requires us as individuals in society to give no preferential treatment one to another. I think that's to misunderstand what it is to be human, I think, at a really deep fundamental level. And maybe the same is true of other values which become impossible only because they are understood in ways which make them detached from human nature, human experience, human society.
Julian, we started this conversation with the Enlightenment and with the question how individualism and collectivism were weighed in the Enlightenment tradition. We got onto liberal values and to perhaps a certain, shall we say, hubris or complacency in the liberal world, and the values that it seems to have developed in the world and that we're now experiencing backlash to. And you're saying that there are contradictions to be reconciled. So tell me, where are your thoughts going? How can these contradictions be reconciled? Or, to ask it differently, in a time when our democracies are in probably the most serious crisis of their existence, because, as I said before, people seem to withdraw their trust from the system of democracy for perhaps quite good reasons, but anyway, people appear to do that. In a time when this is happening, and when what seemed to be a sort of manifest destiny of democratic triumph has been totally called into question, we can quite easily imagine living in dictatorships again, or in some sort of authoritarian regime. How is it possible to build a good and secular society between all those different truths and values?
Well, that's a big question. I wouldn't dare to say I have the answer. I think what we need is going back to what's becoming a bit of my mantra, really, which is, I think people who see themselves on the side of these values have to ask some really tough questions of themselves about how these values are, whether they are properly weighted, and whether we're promoting the right versions of them. The two questions, I think, are related. And I think if you were to go through them sort of one by one, you'd find that we've made mistakes time and again. One of the interesting ones actually is around the value of freedom as well, because I think that's one which has become so contested. Everybody is in favour of freedom, but how they interpret it is completely different. And I think, in intellectual history, philosophical history, we have some very rich analyses of the different kinds of freedom and how they work. But I think as you say, in a very short period of time, the way in which this has been taken on in broader society has become rather thin. Freedom has become associated essentially with a kind of consumer freedom. It's my freedom to do what I want, full stop. Without any appreciation of the fact that in order to be truly free, in order to be truly autonomous, you need to have sort of self-awareness. You need to be free from coercion and whatever. And I think in the consumer society, the kind of consumer freedom that is promoted, it suits very, very well the interests of certain businesses and the wealthy.
You have the freedom to choose the color of the model that you're buying.
Exactly. But you don't have the freedom to. Your freedom is compromised because the information environment in which you're being told about these things is full of lies and misinformation, etc., etc. So I think, in broad terms, this is kind of what we need to do. I mean, I do sometimes find it hard to be optimistic, because when you start talking about these things, it seems like you very quickly talk about ideas which are actually quite complex. And so I suppose a real challenge is, you need a kind of political leadership. You need sort of politicians who understand the deep issues here, the deep philosophy, but can translate that into ways of speaking that resonate with people and enable them to understand. And I think you do see some people like that.
For instance?
Well, I don't know. I think Tony Blair is now very unpopular, largely because of the Iraq war. And I think it'd be very interesting to see how his legacy would have been treated if it weren't for that war. Because his government was pretty effective. If you look at certain metrics around things like child poverty and pensioner poverty, equality, economy, they did pretty good things. They also introduced this wonderful scheme, the Sure Start, aimed at helping children and parents in the first few years of birth. And it was not very expensive. It was shown to work. It was later abolished. It was terrible. And I think he was able to kind of say things. I mean, no rights and responsibilities. He just used that thing all the time. No rights without responsibilities. And that did resonate with people. People did, because, people understood that was the case. And that message did get through.
It's a very interesting example that you bring, because, I mean, you can say many things about Tony Blair and the Iraq War and his hubris in the Middle East, etc. But he gave people a project. And I have a very strong feeling that our societies have lost their project. There is no collective project that is recognized by anyone that we are engaged in. Funnily enough, now European countries are sort of forced, shoehorned into a project by the Ukraine war. And all of a sudden they have a concrete future scenario that necessitates change. But I mean, it does seem to me that our societies have lost a common project, and that's bad for democracy. It's particularly bad for left politics, because left politics are about a good future, about a better future. And if you've lost the credibility of the idea that there is a future for any of us, or that it can be good, then I think left politics become very difficult. They lose all their emotional resonance.
You're very right. I think that's a good way of putting it. And I mean, there are lots of examples of this. I think one of the clearest examples was the referendum in the UK to leave the European Union. Now, there were two campaigns going on there. The Leave campaign had, I think the word narrative is overused, but they had a straightforward narrative: take back control, right? Simple as that. The Remain had no strong narrative at all. It was just like, this is going to hurt your pocket, it's going to make you poorer, etc. Where was the project? Where was the narrative? Now, I think the UK's always had a bit of a problem with the EU as a project anyway, to be honest. So I think that maybe the British people never got on board the EU as a project. They always saw it as something. But it felt like it was crying out for somebody to sort of present a positive vision of what a future in the EU was, which wasn't just about free trade and being able to go on holiday without a passport, And I think and the same thing happens again. I think we're struggling now with the Labour government in the UK under Keir Starmer. They're not really. People complain they don't know what they stand for. They don't know what they want. And I think this is actually a bit unfortunate, because I suspect they do know what they want. Actually, I had it's not a boast. I knew Keir Starmer a little bit many years ago. I used to play football with him. And I knew he was a very deeply committed guy politically, or a guy on the left. Doesn't come across. He comes across as someone who's just trying to manage the economy.
He's very, very tight-lipped.
So you're right. Where's the project? Where's the vision? Because at the moment, the people who the projects and the vision are generally on the populist right, and their projects and the vision is to maintain their culture, protect it from invaders, or mythical invaders, whatever it might be, and people like the sound of that. There's a line, I don't know if you're a fan of the Big Lebowski, the film, but there's a line which I go back to time and again, when they're being attacked by a group of nihilists, and people go, oh, nihilists, oh my God, what are they? And he goes, and one character says, oh, nihilists, they're the worst, it's, worse than fascists, because say what you like about National Socialism, at least it was an ideology, right? So it's a great joke, because it's true. I think, if you don't even have a kind of vision, then people will go for some other vision, even if it's worse,
But I mean, this is a very timely reminder, because a vision can also be National Socialism. Visions are not by themselves, in themselves, benign. And you do feel if there's one vision, one common project collapsing, there is this vacuum that other visions push into. Other narratives push into, and it's absolutely uncertain which of these will win. Certainly not the nicest, necessarily.
No, exactly. But then this is where we need not so much intellectuals, philosophers, etc. people with different kind of spirit. How can we articulate this vision, this project? What is the project we want? I mean, if I was to try and describe it to someone, say, well, you liberals, what do you really want? So, well, we want a society in which everyone can live in dignity, and everyone can have the good things in life, irrespective of their birth chances, etc., and in which people can live together despite their differences in their values, etc., etc. I mean, in a way, that sounds lovely, but I don't know. For some reason, this vision isn't resonating with people, and I think perhaps one reason is because they don't believe in it anymore, because that's what they were promised for a long time, and it's not what they were actually given. That these so-called lovely liberal democracies, which were serving everyone, still had their underclasses, the poor who weren't really being served, and what it really meant to embrace difference, etc.
But I think there's also more. Yeah, outside the difference is a big thing, but I think, you say that people were disappointed because the societies didn't deliver. On the other hand, they delivered hugely. And therefore, they made basically the struggle unnecessary. And I think that is also part of the story. That once, we are built to take for granted what we already have. I think that is a human constant. And, you notice that, anybody will notice that when you get ill or break a leg or something, and all of a sudden you realize, hey, I've always taken that for granted, to walk normally around. And I never thought how precious this was and how much I need to do to maintain it. Well, you notice that when it's gone. And I think, these things have been established so firmly that for a lot of people, they're no longer precious things to struggle for, but they're just things to rely on.
I think you're right. I think that to say it hasn't delivered is not true to a certain extent.
It's delivered not for some, but it has delivered for many.
Yeah, exactly. There's also the benchmarks people use, though, isn't it? Because I think that one thing happening was that generations did see of things improving, and then in certain domains it didn't for some people. I think the other thing that annoyed people perhaps was when we became intensely relaxed about inequality, as Peter Mandelson once put it. People thought, their quality of life may be all very well, but they were seeing other people just sort of get filthy rich, and that seemed to be unfair to them as well. But yeah, so I think what you're saying has got a lot of truth in it, for sure.
Just to wrap up, Julian, Enlightenment values today, Enlightenment ideals today, the idea of individuality, was this a beautiful pipe dream that humanity dreamt for 300 years, and that is now quietly being demolished again because it served its usefulness, and we will soon all be ruled by AI anyway? Or is there a real transformative potential in these ideas still that can carry us in through the world of AI, that can carry us also through, for instance, a political situation of imperial powers sharing up the world, and, well, the Enlightenment values such as equality of men and women that people fought for generations being quietly rolled back, or very spectacularly rolled back. Is there still a transformative potential in these ideas that we can build on?
I think there is. I think some of them have taken root. You say it's not a long time in history, but some things have really taken root. And I think certain things around equality of the sexes, for example, we're not there with it. Maybe we don't quite understand fully what that means either, to be honest. But I think that generations of women are just not going to want to give up those rights anytime soon. And even in surprising places like Saudi Arabia, there is still positive progress in that direction. In America, despite its setbacks, LGBTQ people have been much more accepted in recent decades than they were. They were behind the curve on that. So I think there is hope, but it's the fragility of it, and I think that's the thing which, again, so many people say this. If there's one, I think that John Gray in the UK has exaggerated the extent to which liberals are guilty of believing that progress is inevitable and doesn't have to be worked for. I think that the smartest Enlightenment proponents have always known that things can go in reverse, and they need fighting for. So yeah, there is a possibility, but I'm not a futurologist, and I'm not confident. I'm not confident about the short to medium term prospects for a lot of these things, because I think one lesson of history we have forgotten is that tyranny can establish itself quite quickly in the right stroke wrong circumstances, and that I think there is a complacency that we don't have to worry about this because it can't happen here. It could.
It could, yes, and I come from a country where it did, so seeing all the early signs bubbling up again is an interesting experience, which is why it's a fantastic time to be a historian, just not such a fantastic time to be contemporary. Julian Baggini, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I have a feeling we've got so much left to talk about. Perhaps you'd be kind enough to come on again another time.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. I'm glad I've been able to pick your brains. It's been very useful for me, very interesting.
Okay, well, thanks so much, and I hope for another conversation. And thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again with another episode of the BlomCast. Bye-bye.